For generations, humanity has celebrated the extension of human life as our crowning achievement. We have conquered historical diseases and pushed the boundaries of biological survival. But beneath the surface of this demographic triumph lies a predatory macroeconomic reality. We are living longer, but our wealth is dying sooner. This is not merely a crisis of personal finance, it is the genesis of an invisible, structural blind recession that threatens to trigger a systemic contraction across the entire global economic order. According to the Longevity Preparedness Index, developed by John Hancock with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Age Lab, United States adults scored a dismal average of 60 out of 100 across the domains of aging. By the year 2050, the population of Americans aged 65 or older is projected to skyrocket from 58 million to 82 million. Yet, the data reveals a terrifying reality. Nearly 4 in 10 of these individuals will face absolute financial instability as they age. Even more harrowing, the metric for care preparedness collapsed to a staggering 42 out of 100. The mainstream media frames this catastrophe as an individual failure of discipline, telling citizens to simply spend less, but they are blind to the broader institutional collapse. We are entering a profound trust recession where the traditional safety net is actively disintegrating. What happens when biological longevity completely outlives financial longevity? When tens of millions of elderly citizens cross the threshold of retirement with $0, who will bear the ultimate macroeconomic cost? To understand how tens of millions of elderly citizens are marching toward a financial precipice with $0 in their accounts, we must dissect a structural assassination, the deliberate eradication of the traditional pension empire. In 1980, nearly 60% of private sector workers across the United States were shielded by defined benefit pensions. These were corporate contracts that guaranteed a predictable monthly paycheck from retirement until death. The macroeconomic risk of inflation, market crashes, and longevity rested squarely on corporate balance sheets, insulated from the individual worker. However, a massive structural realignment took place. Over the next 4 decades, financial institutions and corporate boards orchestrated what economists call the Great Risk Shift. They systematically demolished pensions, forcing the institutional participation rate down to less than 15% today. In its place, they engineered defined contribution mechanisms, forcing ordinary citizens to rely entirely on the 401k and individual retirement accounts. With a single systemic pivot, the entire burden of global market volatility, domestic inflation, and biological longevity was transferred from multi-billion-dollar corporations onto the shoulders of individuals. The working class was forced to become accidental hedge fund managers, navigating hyper-complex asset allocations with zero formal financial education. This institutional collapse created a trust recession, leaving the public hopelessly exposed to the predatory fluctuations of Wall Street while masking a systemic contraction as a simple failure of personal discipline. But the absolute failure of this 401k experiment is merely a symptom of a far deeper, malicious trap. While the public believes they are simply undersaving due to poor personal choices, the brutal reality is that the entire retirement infrastructure was never actually designed to sustain human life. It was born out of an obscure tax loophole that Wall Street weaponized for capital accumulation. And right now, as the first massive wave of baby boomers enters their twilight years, an invisible, state-sanctioned financial vacuum is waiting in the shadows. It is a hidden legal mechanism engineered to systematically liquidate your family's entire generational wealth, seize your home, and leave your adult children completely bankrupt the exact second you require long-term assisted care. And the most terrifying part? There is absolutely nothing your financial advisor can do to stop it. The terrifying mechanism that turns a long life into a financial death sentence begins at the precise intersection of biological decline and institutional collapse. According to the empirical data, the single lowest metric within the Longevity Preparedness Index is care preparedness, which bottomed out at an alarming 42 out of 100 points. This 42-point failure marks the exact geographic coordinate of the modern retirement black hole. Most individuals mistakenly assume that their primary retirement threat is a sudden stock market crash or a correction in real estate, but the true systemic contagion is the astronomical cost of cognitive and physical degradation. When chronic conditions or neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia take hold of an aging population, they do not follow a swift or predictable path. They run an agonizing course. that frequently last between 5 to 7 years. During this prolonged window of severe physical vulnerability, the patient requires what the state defines as custodial care, round-the-clock assistance with basic daily living activities. The macroeconomic invoice for this specialized non-medical care is devastating, easily surpassing $100,000 to $150,000 every single year. For an average family, a 5-year battle with dementia translates into an unmitigated liability of $750,000, completely obliterating a lifetime of diligent 401k contributions within the blink of an eye. Faced with this predictable demographic wave, the private financial sector has chosen absolute abdication over structural adaptation. The long-term care insurance market has suffered a catastrophic institutional collapse, with major insurance providers eradicating nearly 80% of all long-term care insurance products from the open market. The actuary tables of these multi-billion-dollar conglomerates realized a terrifying mathematical truth. The longevity of the modern human population is completely uninsurable under private market models. This corporate retreat brings us directly to the trap hidden within public policy, the legal mechanism of asset spend down and Medicaid estate recovery. The vast majority of Americans falsely believe that Medicare, the universal health insurance policy for the elderly, will cover their nursing home or home care costs. It does not. Medicare strictly covers acute medical treatment, leaving long-term custodial care entirely unsubsidized. The only state entity that will step in to pay for long-term assisted living is Medicaid, a social welfare program explicitly reserved by law for individuals living in absolute poverty. To qualify for this state assistance, elderly citizens are legally forced to undergo a brutal process called spending down. They must systematically liquidate every single asset to their name, including personal savings, stocks, bonds, and corporate investments, until they have less than $2,000 remaining in liquid cash. Only when they are rendered completely destitute will the state absorb their care costs. But the systemic extraction does not stop at the grave. Through the federally mandated Medicaid estate recovery program, the state reserves the right to seize the deceased individual's home, the primary vehicle of generational wealth transfer for the working class, to reimburse itself for the care provided. This state-sanctioned asset seizure represents a feedback crisis of unprecedented scale, ensuring that the wealth accumulated by an entire generation is completely vaporized, permanently entrenching a cycle of multi-generational financial vulnerability. The economic shockwave of an underprepared, aging populace does not stop with the elderly. It ricochets violently downward into the prime age workforce, giving rise to a severe structural vice known as the sandwich generation crisis. Millions of middle-aged adults, predominantly spanning Generation X and older millennials, find themselves trapped in a crippling economic chokehold. They are simultaneously forced to shoulder the skyrocketing costs of raising their own children while being dragged into the unpaid, highly demanding role of primary caregiver for their deteriorating parents. This creates a severe labor force contraction hidden in plain sight. As the index for care preparedness collapses, the structural shortage of professional nursing staff forces family members to step into the structural void. This is not a harmless act of familial love, it is an immense economic drain. Economic data indicates that a massive proportion of these family caregivers are forced to reduce their professional working hours, turn down well-deserved career advancements, or completely exit the labor market during their peak earning years. The macroeconomic fallout of this mass labor exodus is devastating to national productivity. When highly skilled workers abandon corporate balance sheets to perform manual caregiving duties at home, the entire economy suffers a massive loss of human capital. This systemic contraction directly reduces gross domestic product growth, shrinks the federal and state income tax base, and places an insupportable burden on corporate operations trying to navigate chronic labor shortages. For over a decade, macroeconomic forecasters have heralded the onset of the Great Wealth Transfer, a historic economic phenomenon where an estimated $36 trillion was projected to cascade down from aging baby boomers to their struggling millennial descendants. This monumental capital relocation was supposed to serve as an economic life raft, allowing younger generations to finally achieve stable home ownership, liquidate their crippling student loan obligations, and inject entrepreneurial capital into the real economy. However, the state-sanctioned asset spend down and institutional care liquidation trap have completely subverted this projection, turning the great wealth transfer into the great wealth evaporation. Instead of circulating downward into the productive segments of the macroeconomy, this $36 trillion mountain of generational capital is being systematically vacuumed up by private equity-backed healthcare conglomerates, corporate nursing home chains, and administrative medical bureaucracies. When an elderly citizen is forced to exhaust their entire net worth to zero just to secure a bed in a subsidized facility, the primary engine of middle-class wealth accumulation is permanently extinguished. The economic downstream effects of this capital destruction are profound. Young families, deprived of their expected ancestral inheritances, remain permanently locked out of the asset-building market, deepening the structural wealth inequality gap. This total capital drain creates an aggressive feedback crisis where the younger generation is simultaneously robbed of their future financial foundation while being forced to drain their current income to support a failing, top-heavy demographic structure. The micro-level financial ruin of millions of individual American households inevitably aggregates into a macro-level catastrophe for the state, feeding directly into a structural fiscal death spiral. As nearly 40% of the elderly population crosses into absolute financial instability, their reliance on the state-funded Medicaid infrastructure shifts from an occasional safety net to an absolute baseline of survival. Because Medicaid is funded jointly by federal and state governments, this massive demographic migration forces an unprecedented, non-discretionary expansion of public expenditures. To finance this exploding liability of demographic maintenance, the United States Department of the Treasury must continuously issue accelerating quantities of sovereign debt obligations. This structural reality crowds out the nation's capacity to execute strategic capital investments. When an escalating share of the federal budget is automatically consumed by interest payments on the national debt and the non-productive costs of medicalized elderly care, the state is forced to hollow out its funding for technological research, infrastructure, modernization, and domestic industrial policy. Furthermore, the imminent exhaustion of the Social Security trust funds within the next decade presents the state with a brutal macroeconomic paradox. The government must either drastically slash retirement benefits, which would immediately plunge tens of millions of elderly citizens into extreme poverty and trigger a massive consumer contraction, or rapidly escalate payroll taxes on the younger working class. Choosing the latter option suffocates the disposable income and productivity of the prime age workforce, effectively paralyzing the primary engine of domestic economic growth and inducing a permanent state of structural economic stagnation. On the global stage, the domestic American Hoot Tree crisis acts as a potent catalyst for a broader institutional trust recession, calling into question the long-term stability of the Western economic model. For the past century, international capital markets and foreign central banks have anchored the global financial architecture around United States Treasury bonds, operating under the assumption that the world's premier superpower possessed an unassailable financial foundation. However, as international observers witness the American state suffocating under an unfunded, non-productive demographic liability, that fundamental institutional trust begins to fracture. Geopolitical adversaries and rival economic alliances perceive this internal demographic decay as a definitive strategic vulnerability. A superpower whose financial flexibility is completely paralyzed by the necessity of sustaining an impoverished, aging electorate cannot effectively project global influence, enforce maritime security, or finance large-scale international development projects. The capital that should be deployed to maintain technological hegemony and defensive capabilities is instead permanently trapped within a collapsing domestic entitlement apparatus. Ultimately, this forces the Federal Reserve and the political establishment to continually debase the currency, using inflationary monetary mechanisms to monetize the expanding national debt required for elderly survival. This long-term degradation of purchasing power directly threatens the structural hegemony of the United States dollar as the undisputed global reserve currency. The internal financial collapse of the American retiree ceases to be a localized social welfare issue. It mutates into an existential vulnerability that accelerates the transition toward a multipolar global financial order, permanently undermining Western geopolitical dominance. As the global economy faces this demographic gridlock, the traditional structures of state care and private insurance are proving entirely obsolete. Out of this institutional collapse, however, a radical long-term realignment is emerging, driven by a desperate fusion of advanced automation and a total restructuring of financial accountability. The primary relief valve for this systemic contraction will not come from legislative reform or tax hikes, but from the aggressive deployment of automated labor and advanced biotechnology. We are already witnessing the genesis of this paradigm shift with the commercial scaling of specialized automation firms like Loki Robotics, which are introducing autonomous home care systems priced around $22,500. These advanced machines, engineered with tactile precision down to a single ounce of physical sensitivity, represent the vanguard of structural automation. Coupled with consumer biometric devices that stream continuous health telemetry directly to decentralized medical networks, artificial intelligence will inevitably replace the vanishing workforce of human nursing staff. International venture capital is already shifting away from traditional healthcare infrastructure and aggressively consolidating into corporate robotics, identifying this sector as the only viable mechanism to bypass the severe human caregiver deficit. Concurrently, the global financial industry is undergoing a forced evolution. Because 80% of legacy long-term care insurance products have been permanently eradicated from corporate balance sheets due to structural uninsurability, a new class of asset-backed hybrid vehicles is rising. Investment houses are engineering integrated solutions that combine lifetime annuities with active equity market instruments, attempting to construct personal liquidity moats that can insulate capital from the predatory spend-down laws of the state. Ultimately, the most profound resolution to this crisis rests on the absolute enforcement of personal responsibility. The historic myth of the state-guaranteed retirement is dead. To survive this unfolding trust recession, the younger generation must actively reject the structural complacency of past cohorts who mistakenly assumed the system would perpetually sustain them. Individuals are now forced to treat personal finance as an asymmetric warfare zone, constructing independent, multi-asset defense funds outside of the eroding public entitlement framework. Those who fail to execute this strategic transition during their peak earning years will inevitably be crushed by the systemic contraction, falling victim to a personal blind recession from which there is no institutional escape. The unfolding crisis of modern retirement is not a distant macroeconomic anomaly scheduled to arrive in the twilight of the century. It is an active structural erosion occurring right now beneath the very foundations of the global financial architecture. By tracking the trajectory from the systematic assassination of the guaranteed pension empire to the predatory legal landscape of asset liquidations and state spend-downs, we uncover a devastating reality. Biological longevity has successfully broken the back of our financial infrastructure. What we are witnessing is the consolidation of a highly destructive feedback crisis. The financial depletion of the elderly does not remain isolated within specialized care facilities. It aggressively cannibalizes the disposable capital, workplace productivity, and labor participation of the younger generation. As state budgets buckle under the non-productive liabilities of demographic maintenance and public debt expands toward absolute infinity, the structural integrity of the nation's economic sovereignty begins to decay. This is the definition of a blind recession, a slow-motion macroeconomic choking hazard, where the cost of biological survival systematically outpaces the financial mechanisms engineered to sustain it. This reality forces us to confront an existential question about the true trajectory of human progress. When biological longevity permanently outlives financial longevity, are we inadvertently engineering a civilization where a longer life is transformed into a systemic punishment rather than a monumental human achievement? If the ultimate reward for a lifetime of economic contribution is the state-sanctioned liquidation of your family's generational assets, then the very core of the modern social contract has suffered a fatal institutional collapse. The future belongs exclusively to those who possess the macroeconomic clarity to recognize these structural traps before they spring. To ensure you navigate this shifting financial landscape with data-driven precision, join our community of global analysts. Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis.